The Light of Hope by Andy Clark. The ship's bridge shuddered violently. Lumen flickered. Alarming groans came from all around as the vessel weathered unnatural waves of pressure. Deck plates thrummed as though their rivets were about to pop out and send them spinning away. The robes and hair of the bridge crew twitched in a wind no one could feel. To Armsman Feln, it felt as though something huge had taken hold of the radiant light and was shaking it. The moment the thought entered his head, he fought to banish it again. Ideas, thoughts, imagination, those kinds of things had power in the warp, or so he had been taught. His training helped him blank out dangerous distractions, and he fell back on it now, biting his lip as he silently repeated the litany of blessed thoughtlessness in his head. Feln clung to the side of the Voxman's console with one hand and gripped his shotgun with the other. He swept his eyes around the bridge, ignoring the panicked voices of the crew as he scoured the shadows for movements or shapes that shouldn't be there. If a nightmare manifested, he would gun it down or die trying, he thought. The notion of violent action, of actually engaging a foe he could fight, gave him some scant comfort.
Vox, contact the navigator's sanctum again,
spat Captain Jessin.
Find out what in the 17 heretical hells Baufomt thinks he's doing.
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am,
replied the Vox officer, his voice tight.
Helm, be ready for crash translation to real space,
ordered Jessin. The lumen blinked out altogether, leaving the bridge illuminated only by the cold glow of runic consoles and static-furred vidscreens. Wild eyes stared from underlit faces. Feln racked the slide of his gun one-handed and began to mutter his prayers out loud, hearing the bridge's other armsmen follow suit. He felt a trickle of sweat running slow and cold down the nape of his neck as their voices joined in a tremulous chant. It was strengthened as Jessin's clear voice rang out in chorus with theirs.
And lo, though we pass through the terrors of the warp, we shall fear neither heresy or malfeasance, for the sacred energies of the Geller field enfold us, and the divine light of the Astronomicon is our guide.
Feln stumbled over that last line. He knew it was not true. That was the whole problem, as he understood it. The cause of this voyage's hellish conditions. The Astronomicon was gone. It was nowhere to be found. They were as good as flying blind, on a voyage they would not even have risked had not the world of Jashoria Prime been in such desperate need of reinforcement. Yet the system's capital planet had screamed out for aid, and its outlying colonies were oath-bound to provide it. After all, the higher-ups had blustered. The journey was but a single short warp jump. And so they had set out, 4 troop carriers packed with Jashorian guardsmen. He wondered how the other 3 ships were faring. Had they made it already? Had they been devoured? Were they trapped forever in the merciless grip of ineffable forces that... He stopped himself and got to praying again, sweating more profusely than ever. The lumen flickered and died, flickered and died. In each brief burst of illumination, Feln thought he saw ghostly after-images stealing across the bridge. He struggled to focus, praying louder and bringing his shotgun up as his eyes chased greasy phantoms that were there and gone before he could be sure he'd seen anything at all. The officers around him glanced up from their stations, watching his weapons muzzle with anxious eyes.
Vox, I am waiting,
barked Captain Jessin. Feln felt his courage bolstered at the sight of her sat, straight-backed and proud in her command throne.
Captain, I've tried, ma'am, but all I'm getting back is... screaming,
reported the Voxman in a small, scared voice.
Enough of this, we're dropping out now. Emperor, hang the risks,
declared the captain.
Captain, wait! I have something,
said the Voxman, hunching over his console, pressing his headset tight to his ear.
Navigator Baufomt sees a chink of light amidst the storm.
Throne be praised, a sight of the Astronomicon at last,
replied Jessin, and Feln felt a flare of hope.
Tell the navigator to follow that light and get us clear.
He says he's already doing so, ma'am, whether you so order or no,
said the Voxman.
Of course he is, pampered mutant coward.
Said Jessin.
Armsmen, stand to. Navigation, rouse the sensors and get them compliant. Weapons, intone the mantras of wrath and wake the weapon spirits. All stations prepare for violent and immediate translation to real space, no mark.
Feln shouted his assent. Pushing off from the console, he staggered through the gloom and snatched hold of a bracing loop near the chamber's edge. Clambering up several iron rungs and then turning with practiced ease to face in towards the bridge, Feln slid back into his allocated alcove. He locked his boots in place and brought his gun up. He and his fellows now had the entire upper deck of the bridge in their sights. Should anything unnatural attempt to manifest during translation, it would be trapped in a blizzard of shot. So would the bridge crew, of course. But even the lowliest naval conscript knew that it was better to fall to a shotgun blast than to be prey to a warp entity. Any second, thought Feln. Any second. The feeling of translation was sudden and terrifying. His stomach plunged and his head reeled with false acceleration, as though he had been pushed suddenly from a great height. He smelt pungent herbs and vomit and fresh cotton and metal and blood. The darkness thickened like tar. Through it, Feln heard voices scream in torment and terror. The captain, his sergeant, his dead sister. The lumen flared back to life, and the bridge gave a tremendous jolt. Cherubic servitors blared Beinharric hymns as sparks drizzled from overloaded conduits. Nausea swept through Feln and was gone, replaced by the pounding of his heart, the swift in and out of his breathing, and a dawning sense of blessed relief.
Translation successful, ma'am,
announced the helm officer, saluting her captain smartly.
Excellent. Now, weapons unshrouded, void shields up, wake the auspexes and open those damned shutters. We're blind and helpless, and there could be anything out there,
said Jessin. Her words proved prophetic as the ship shuddered and alarms wailed. Feln's relief withered. He gripped his weapon tight. He knew the feeling of weapons' impacts on the hull of the ship only too well, felt them as though they struck his own body.
That was hostile fire. Get those bloody shields up, now,
ordered the captain, as another ominous jolt shook the bridge.
I regret to report that, barring a miracle of the Omnissiah, the shields will not awaken,
came the voice of the bridge's tech magos, Omnix.
Whatever foe assails us struck first at their blessed emitters. Their second volley inflicted significant damage to our primary thrust engines.
Auspex giving multiple returns, ma'am,
reported the sensor officer, his hands darting over his runic controls.
Throne. I read 3, no 4 ships, large and in combat dispersal, and some sort of huge thermal energy signature dead ahead.
Check the designators. Are any of them ours?
Asked Jessin, but the officer was already shaking his head in dismay.
Negative, Captain. Designators heavily corrupted. They... Emperor have mercy.
At last, the armored bridge shutters rattled upwards on their tracks, and as Feln stared out at the view that was revealed, he felt terror fill his chest until he could barely draw breath. He looked down at the shotgun, impotent in his hands. 4 huge warships hung in space, bare hundreds of miles away. Their baroque hulls bristled with spikes and weaponry. Nearby, the listing hulks of Imperial warships and transports burned their oxygen away into the void. Beyond, Feln could see a world that was definitely not Jashoria Prime. Dark clouds were visible, marring its atmosphere, generated from an inferno near its north pole, so immense that it was clearly visible even from space.
Those are Heretic Astartes craft,
breathed Captain Jessin.
Throne. They're within visible distance. How could they possibly risk drawing so close unless they knew precisely where we were going to translate?
I believe that to be the case, ma'am,
said the Vox officer in a voice full of dread. He visibly paled before speaking again.
Navigator Baufont begs your forgiveness and bids you farewell, Captain. He says he cannot look upon the atrocity below any longer.
Farewell? Atrocity? What is that lunatic talking about?
Alert in Navigator's Sanctum, ma'am. Someone's depressurized the entire suite of chambers.
called a deck officer.
By the Emperor, it's open to the void. No life signs, ma'am.
He said it is a pyre, ma'am,
said the Voxman, a haunted look upon his face.
A pyre of psychers, their agonies flaring out into the void to imitate...
To imitate the light of the Astronomicon,
Finished Captain Jessin, as her officer's voice trailed away.
The heretics! They're hailing us, Captain!
Reported the Voxman, swallowing with an audible click.
They wish to speak.
Asked Jessin, incredulous. She turned to Majos Omnix.
How long would repairs on the void shield emitters and engines take?
Servitor crews have already been deployed, Captain. I can provide an 86.3% probability that engine functionality will be fully restored within 4 to 6 hours, while the blessed void shield emitters will be operable again within a window of 3 times that.
I require every bit of functionality you can get me within the next 5 minutes, Majos.
Snapped Jessin.
And astrogation. Work out where in the wide and wild Imperium we are, because that is damn well not Jashoria Prime down there.
Captain, with the respect due your station, it would require a miracle from the Omnissiah himself for me to provide you with any meaningful repairs in the time frame specified,
said Omnix, his digitized voice blaring over the astrogation officer's reply.
You're a priest, aren't you? Then pray,
said Jessin, before turning her attention on the sweating Voxman.
Open a channel. Let us see if we can keep them talking long enough for Omnix's machine god to furnish us with some divine intervention.
Looking like he might vomit, the Voxman slid his hand across his console to the flashing rune that would open a channel of communication with the agents of the archenemy. Still locked into his alcove, Armsman Feln realized he was shaking at the thought of hearing the foe's terrible voice. The wild thought of turning his gun on the Voxman rose unbidden in his mind, and he had to force the impulse down. His captain had given this order in an attempt to save the ship that Feln was part of. If it stood even the slightest chance of saving the radiant light from annihilation, then surely enduring even this horror was worthwhile. The grating voice that burst from the bridge's vox emitters made him reconsider that thought. It was redolent with evil, thick with malice so ancient and so venomous that it made Feln feel physically weak.
Lapdogs of the Emperor, abase yourselves before Lord Cavaros of the Black Legion. Swear fealty to Abaddon the Despoiler and the ruinous powers here, now, and I may yet deign to spare your miserable lives.
Captain Jessin flinched, as though struck a physical blow. The awful voice echoed around the bridge like thunder. Several members of the crew whimpered and shrank back behind their consoles. Jessin's stern gaze found each wavering soul and pinned them to their stations with the weight of its disapproval. She lifted her vox horn from the arm of her throne, gripping it white-knuckled and drawing a deep breath before thumbing its send rune.
Do I address the captain of the enemy fleet? She asked.
Feln felt pride at how steady her voice was.
You address your new master, mortal,
came the snarling reply.
My master is the Emperor of Mankind,
said Captain Jessin, shooting a glance at Majos Omnix, where he hunched over his console, working furiously. The tech priest gave no sign he had noticed her look.
The Emperor is dead,
spat the voice, and Feln felt bone-deep dismay at the words.
Lies,
cried Jessin.
Then where is your precious Astronomicon?
Asked Lord Cavaros, and Feln's gorge rose at the cruel glee he heard in the Black Legionnaire's voice. Could it be true, he thought. Feln felt the world spin about him as his sanity threatened to snap.
There is nothing left of the Imperium but burning worlds and mountains of the dead,
growled Cavaros.
Our darkness swallows all. Our hate has conquered your pathetic faith. Submit now, or die.
Jessin stood, expression grim, as the telltale ping of hostile weapons locks cut through the appalled silence on the bridge. She shook her head slowly, and Feln saw the decision surface upon his captain's noble features. There would be no divine intervention, he thought. from the Omnissiah or the God Emperor, if either of them even still endured. There was only the radiant light and the overwhelming forces of the heretic Astartes, and there could be only one reply.
Lord Kavaros,
Began Jessin, her voice steely with anger.
you may take your lies and your threats and carry them out of the nearest airlock. The Emperor protects, you filthy, traitorous heretic.
The Voxman broke the link at a chopping motion from Jessin, cutting off Lord Kavaros's cruel laughter. The next instant, alarms shrilled across the bridge, and the lumen flashed crimson. Macro ordnance incoming, said some detached part of Feln's mind. Shield still down. The Emperor was gone, and the radiant light was about to die. His gun dropped with a clang from his nerveless hands.
Duty to the end, weapons.
The captain began, then white fire filled the bridge. The dark and howling void followed after. Armsmen fell, welcomed them both.